Okay, so today we're talking about quality of earnings, and I've got Evan Ottaviano with me here, who's a senior manager at Bennett Thrasher. And Bennett Thrasher is a public accounting and consulting firm. And Evan specializes in quality of earnings. We met at M&A Source in Denver a few weeks back now, where he held a workshop on quality of earnings. A very good one. So I asked him to join me here today, and he's here. Lovely to have you here. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. It was very insightful. And also a good opportunity to catch up after the conference. How have you been?
Been well. The deal market is still going full speed ahead. So been busy. Busy is a good thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It is, isn't it? Um, and on the topic of quality of earnings, one key aspect of financial preparation is, when a business owner is looking to sell, is quality of earnings. And we will take both a sell side and a buy side perspective today. Um,
Hmm.
this these sessions are for business owners, so it's usually a sell side perspective. But
Right.
in any transaction, it's very important to understand the buy side, and maybe even more so when it comes to financial preparation and quality of earnings, because you want to understand in advance what business acquirers will ask and prepare for that and negotiate in terms of that as well. So, Evan, why? What's your perspective on why quality of earnings is so important, and how should a business owner think about quality of earnings when it comes to that preparation for an exit?
Yep. Great question. And I mean, you alluded to it a little bit. And one of the key reasons why a quality of earnings is so important to a seller is because it's important to a buyer, and it's a big part of the diligence being completed by a buyer, right? And so one of the main reasons that buyers get quality of earnings is for outside sort of third parties, lenders, insurance underwriters, private equity groups and their investment committees often require them. Boards of directors. So there's all kinds of reasons why they're required. And so, it's helpful for a seller to look at the quality of earnings through the lens of a buyer, right? And so, a seller should be thinking, what's the best way I can position my company sort of in the best light to go to market? And one of the best ways to do that is to have your own sell side quality of earnings prepared, right? And a lot of times, for entrepreneurs and for business owners, a liquidity event involving their business is kind of the largest financial transaction of their life, right? So you want to get ahead of things. You want to prepare. Making that investment in a quality of earnings on the front end is really, really important. And the quality of earnings does a couple of things. One, it gives a lot of credibility to the numbers. Two, it allows you to get out ahead of issues before a buyer discovers them. It allows you to fix those issues on the front end. One of the worst things, or one of the things you don't want to happen, is to go out to market, the buyer finds the issue, and then they try to retrade the deal, lower their offer, things like that, right? And then another thing that the the sell side diligence does, it makes the buy side diligence a lot more perfunctory, a lot more streamlined, and typically faster, right? And particularly in sort of today's market where there's supply chain issues, inflation, rising interest rates, all of these factors, the more you can reduce the time to close, you're kind of less susceptible to outside influences, right? And another thing that we see a lot is sellers, they think, my company's already audited or they are reviewed, so I don't need a quality of earnings analysis, right? And so one of the things to keep in mind is that a quality of earnings or Q of E is not the same thing as an audit or a review. The Q of E does, in a lot of ways, attempt to align the financials with GAAP principles, but it's not always the case. There are certain things that don't get adjusted for, like stock compensation, which is strictly a cash expense. From an audit perspective, it belongs on the P&L, but for a Q of E, because its valuation is derived from cash flow, it's a non-cash item, something like that's not adjusted. But that's just one example. And the other thing is, an audit only focuses on fiscal periods. They don't focus on a trailing 12-month period, which is typically where bankers and sellers and buyers are sort of laser focused in terms of deriving value. You hear a lot about, a multiple of EBITDA. Oftentimes it's being applied to a trailing 12-month EBITDA. And so the other thing I'll mention in terms of audit versus Q of E, an audit's not looking at things monthly, right? A quality of earnings does, and that becomes really important when you're looking at trends. A lot of that is not going to come up during an audit. When you're looking at seasonality, for example, you're not going to see that in an annual period. And really just from a buyer's perspective and trying to understand the economics of a business, looking at it monthly is very, very helpful. And so, if I were a seller, one of the things I'd recommend, I know we were talking about this earlier about, kind of on the front end, right? Even if I'm, say, 3-5 years out from trying to sell my business, what are some of the things I can be doing to prepare? One of the things you could do is have sort of a lighter touch quality of earnings prepared. Maybe it's not a full-blown analysis with a full report, but it'll give you a sense of the things that a buyer is going to be looking for. And you can prepare for that ahead of time and really just have the lens of, almost always performing diligence on yourself, so that when you do go to market, it's going to be a lot more streamlined, a little less painful of a process.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's some really good points there. And I think also, especially with making that differentiation between an audit and quality of earnings, and that, for example, the trailing 12 months, because it's so important to understand the last 12 months and looking at the trends and the seasonality, that will say a lot and kind of where it's going, except for perhaps mid-pandemic, there was some exceptions, but usually that's always the case. So that's great. And
Right.
when we're looking at an analysis of a quality of earnings, what is a buyer looking for in particular?
So, strictly looking at the quality of earnings, a buyer is looking at those monthly trends. And one of the reasons they're looking at those trends is to try to isolate and identify, anomalies in the numbers, right? They're looking for things that are one time, that are non-recurring, that are perhaps out of period, non-cash, or inconsistent with GAAP or generally accepted accounting principles, right? And so, one-time things, as you mentioned, the pandemic, there are PPP loans that were sort of one-time income. We're seeing a little less of that now as we're further kind of removed from that. Impacts from COVID, whether positive or negative. If there was, one-time sort of litigation payment, or if there's, you moved facilities and there were one-time costs associated with that. Those are all things they're looking for to kind of remove, right? Also looking for non-operating things like personal expenses of owners, maybe charitable contributions, things like that. And then in terms of out of period that I mentioned, a lot of times you have true ups and reserve releases. Perhaps you're reserving for litigation or reserving for bonuses, and then the actual turns out to be less or more than what you reserved. There's going to be an out of period impact there. And then I've mentioned this a couple of times, but inconsistent with GAAP, particularly around revenue recognition. That's always a hot topic, particularly in the middle market, where companies might be perhaps on a cash basis or modified accrual basis of accounting. Making sure your revenue recognition is buttoned up, and if it's not, what adjustments need to be made is critical. Another thing you see a lot in middle market where they might not be fully on an accrual basis of accounting is, payroll accruals, commission accruals, bonus accruals, PTO or vacation accruals. All those come up a lot and are things that buyers look for. And so again, that's strictly on the Q of E, but the quality of earnings typically, while looking at earnings or EBITDA, we also look at working capital and net debt and debt-like items, right? And so just sort of taking a slight step back, most deals are structured on a cash-free, tax-free, and debt-free basis. And that's also assuming a normalized level of working capital is going to be transferred to the buyer. And so that means the seller is going to sweep cash at close, and then the seller is also going to settle any debt. And so debt sounds like sort of a straightforward concept, but there's other things that frequently get treated as debt-like that also sort of serve to reduce the purchase price in effect. And I'll talk about that in more detail a little later on. But in terms of working capital, you'll see sellers want to deliver as little working capital as possible, and buyers want as much as possible. And so at its core, you'll see a net working capital construct. There's typically a peg or a target and a true-up mechanism. But at its core, it's not intended to benefit anybody, the buyer or the seller. It's solely to make sure that the buyer on day one has adequate working capital to run the business, day to day, right? And so there shouldn't be some cash windfall to the buyer, and there also shouldn't be a need to inject cash after buying this company to sort of keep the lights on, so to speak. And so, it really just kind of make sure that sellers aren't trying to game the system by collecting on all their receivables, selling all their inventory, extending payables, and then sticking the buyer with that, right? And then on the net debt side, right, buyers are going to be looking for anything that they could consider to be debt-like. Again, it's going to be a dollar-for-dollar reduction in the purchase price. And this could be something that's either on the balance sheet or off balance sheet. One thing we see a lot, we work a lot in recurring revenue, technology, SaaS type businesses, and a lot of times they're upfront payments from customers. And it can be treated a couple different ways. If I'm the seller, there's a liability associated with that upfront cash. If I'm the seller, I'd like to treat that as working capital. It's going to reduce working capital, suppress working capital. But if I'm the buyer, I'm going to want to treat that as debt-like. And usually some or all of that is treated as debt-like, but it really ultimately impacts sort of the valuation and the cash that the seller ultimately walks away with. So those are some of the things, quality of earnings and the other components that a buyer is going to be looking for.
Yeah, very nice. That's actually a very good segue into my next question, which is if you can speak a little bit more in detail about the difference of working capital and debt-like items in the context specifically of for valuations and pricing, and also connecting the dots there between the working capital, the net working capital, and the debt-like items in business valuations and the impacts of them when it comes to how they're categorized.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great segue and great question. So, just keeping in mind, particularly in sort of the M&A world, you hear a lot about multiples, right? Particularly multiples of EBITDA. And so when you're talking about a multiple of EBITDA, that value that you derive from that calculation is an enterprise value of the company, right? And so what that means is kind of like looking at, your house, right? That's the total value of the house that's derived from that. But what you really want to understand in terms of what an owner is receiving is equity value. So from that enterprise value, you need to deduct debt and debt-like items, right? And so that multiple also assumes a normal level of working capital, as I alluded to earlier. And so, whether you treat, in the example of deferred revenue, as working capital or debt, really is going to impact cash to the seller. There are other things to consider there in terms of the letter of intent. A lot of times that will get flushed out on sort of the front end. If I was a seller or a banker going to market, I would try to be very explicit about, hey, how are we going to treat deferred revenue? when it comes time to close and drafting up the purchase agreement, because all those things are connected. The quality of earnings is connected to the QV, is connected to the working capital, and working capital is very much linked to net debt.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. If we last question, if we jump to add backs and different buyer types, different type of add backs will make sense in different scenarios. For example, if you have a strategic buyer that has marketing operations in a similar topic or industry where you are as a seller, then it might make sense to add back costs for that because they already have existing operations, whereas an individual or financial buyer might not. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, strategic buyers generally are more likely to sort of give credit to synergies. They have a lot of sort of the back office stuff presumably already set up, and they can save on those costs. Similarly on financial buyers, to the extent they might already have, say, a platform company in a similar industry, they might also get to benefit from some of those synergies. We do see that quite often. One thing that sometimes gets overlooked is, the synergies are great and should be considered, but in connection with them, you should also look at, are there any cash costs required to achieve those synergies, right? If we're assuming that there's going to be synergies associated with, reductions in headcount, for example, are there going to be any, is there going to be any severance that needs to be paid, right? That needs to be factored into your model, right? And then also, what's the timeline to achieve those synergies? A lot of the time, it's not going to happen day one, right? Particularly if there are revenue synergies due to cross-selling and things like that. It's not going to happen day one. It may take a year, 2, 3. I mean, it's not all recognized on the front end. So that's something we see quite often that gets overlooked and should definitely be considered.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because the synergies will most likely take half a year, 2 years, or even more, 3, 4 years, and especially until they're fully recognized. So that makes it tricky between the opposing agendas of a buyer and a seller, of course.
Absolutely. And the other thing too is, just because you're recognizing these synergies, they can't be realized without both buyer and seller. So, who's going to get the benefit of that when it comes to valuation, right? I mean, that's somewhat of a negotiating item, but a frequent sort of point of contention.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's also another good point with who's getting that benefit. It's the same as with risks, right? Who's going to take on that risk? So yeah, absolutely. Good point. We're coming to the end here. Lovely to have you here. I think this was really insightful. If someone would like to get in touch with you here, how should they get in touch with you?
Yeah, well, I think the link to our website was in the description, as well as to my bio and my LinkedIn. So best way to reach us is through our website, www.btboytomcpa, like certified public accountant, btcpa.net, and you can find us there.
Super. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.